Certainly, yeah, it's only 46.
I see you dressed in a white kittel today. Wally, you remember Al Fess's delicatessen?
Sure. Used to work there, Erev Pesach.
See that?
Then they moved up next to the bus terminal.
Okay.
Yeah,
Uptown.
Yeah.
Well, downtown.
well, downtown, but up the hill.
Yeah.
And they closed them,
Yeah.
unfortunately. Nice guy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Recording?
You're recording, right? Your conversation. Okay. Year of Learning, sponsored by Yulia and Boris Kagan to commemorate the side of the other people, his father, Yusuf Ben Mato. Hey, tomorrow we'll be back here again with a breakfast, no reservation required. Next week on Tuesday, we have the NATEP birthday club, right, celebrating Daniel Chasen's birthday for the month of Kislev, and he's also giving a shiur as well. That's Tuesday. You need a reservation for that, so please make your reservation. We'll also have a birthday cake and some other things coming up. There'll be a Janish's breakfast on December 26th on a Thursday. If you haven't made a reservation yet, please do so. Okie doke.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I want to thank Yossi for suggesting this morning's topic. I've expanded upon it a bit. The Torah talks about Eretz Zovas Cholov Dvash, the land flowing with milk and honey. Just for clarification purposes, the honey that we're talking about there is date honey. It's not bees honey, just to be aware of it. It's a common misconception. The honey it's talking about in Israel is from dates. But let's talk about milk for a while. It's fascinating that if you're studying Yeridea in terms of food, you really have to know a great deal about biology, anatomy, science, which the rabbis knew in terms of the categorization of many different areas of halacha. Let's just talk about milk for a moment. Milk comes from many, many different animals. It comes from kosher animals, it comes from non-kosher animals. Obviously, we can only consume milk that comes from kosher animals. But the question is, it's a milk conflation type of question. Milk comes from meat, an animal. So how do we consume milk if it comes from meat? It seems to be a contradiction there. So first clarification is that milk comes from, talking about cow's milk now, but it's true for camels, goats as well. Milk comes from the udder. The udder is basically the mammary gland found in female ruminants, in this case, female mammals. And the udder itself presents a number of fascinating halachos. There were people throughout history, and even today, I suppose, that eat the udder. So is the udder fleishik? And what do you deal with all the milk that's in there? And how do you deal with that? So basically, the udder is fleishik, even though it's saturated with milk. And basically, those who want to eat the udder have to roast it very similar to the way you kosher a piece of liver. I don't know how many of you remember before you bought meat in the supermarket that was already koshered, but I remember my mother koshering chickens, koshering liver. You had to broil it, you had to roast, you had special racks in the house. It was a whole big process. But an udder is the same thing. An udder has to be roasted and all the milk has to be taken out. And again, the shilas come up whether it can be cooked with other meats or not. And then there's a lot of discussion in your day about it. The milk that is found in the udder, let's say you slaughter a cow. The cow has milk still in her udder. Minatorah, biblically, you can eat that milk together with the meat in the udder. Rabbinically, of course, we don't do that because it's literally mixing milk and some fleishes. But there's a lot of discussion about the udder. And you could cook it, but it has to be roasted and broiled before you can eat it, for those that eat the udder. But the milk itself it's basically separated from the meat part of the cow. And there's no problem. Of course, milk that we consume in America is all cow's milk. The U.S. Department of Agriculture certifies it, which is the whole reason for Cholav Yisrael. Cholav Yisrael simply means that there was hashgacha over the milking process to make sure that no other foreign milk was added to it. Back in the old days in Europe on the farms, in order to add to the volume of milk that was being sold, they would sometimes add pig's milk, they would add other milk from other animals just to give more volume to what they were selling. So today, there's no problem. There's camel's milk, there's all kinds of other milk you can add. Today, all milk is kosher. And if you want to drink Cholav Yisrael, you may, but it's certainly not mandatory in the United States. Yeah, there is because once you have it on the books, it's very hard to erase it. Yes. Yeah, so that a person who's machmir should be machmir. Yeah, but basically he allows it. I remember Rabbi Kanatopsky used to always ask for a glass of treif milk, meaning because he felt that Cholav Yisrael wasn't necessary. Okay, moving on from milk to honey. The rabbis in the Mishnah discuss the halacha that if something comes from an animal or an entity that is not kosher, then that which comes from that animal, in this case insect, should not be kosher. So the milk of a camel or the eggs from a vulture, these are not kosher because the entity itself is not kosher. Why is bee honey permitted? Why is that kosher? It's a bee is an insect that we may not eat. So why should the honey from the bee be kosher? So we have to know a little bit about how honey is made by the bee. Honey is basically from nectar, which is gathered by the bees from certain flowers and plants, which they transport back to their honeycomb. And in the bee, the nectar is broken down and transformed into honey by various enzymes in the bee. But it is not actually digested by the bee. The honey is not the product of the bee itself, milk. Basically, these enzymes are in the mouth area of the bee, and it's not really swallowed by the bee. So 100% pure raw honey is kosher. And you have to be careful when you buy honey to make sure that there's nothing else added, because sometimes they will add things to the honey that might not be kosher. And that is why honey requires a hechsher, not because the honey by itself is not kosher, the honey is kosher because it is not processed within the bee itself. We can go into a whole discussion about how beehives work. It is fascinating. The OU has a whole series of essays with pictures on it. Basically, the nectar from plants and flowers is a type of sugar, sucrose, juice, basically, from the flower. And the long tongue of the bee, the proboscis, is inserted like a straw into the nectar, and then it's a long process. And inside the bee, there's a storage tank.
You said something, I didn't hear you. I'll put the paper.
Inside the
And wash
bee,
it out each time. Don't leave it like that.
Don't leave it the way I did?
You're right.
Okay. So,
Wash it.
will you use this cup? Is that what?
a regular, yeah, you probably could, because that's not, nothing is added. It's just the honey. If it's harvested from the honeycomb, there's nothing added to it. So that would probably be kosher. But basically, the honeybee is a chemist, if you could call it that. There is a honey sac in the bee, again, not inside the bee, but on the bee, where the nectar is mixed with enzymes that are in the bee, and the molecules change it. I'm not going to go into all the technical stuff there, but basically, the bee does things to that nectar which produce the honey that we have now. So raw honey, you could buy a honeycomb with the honey still in it. And that would not be a problem because it's basically not a secretion from inside, it's simply from the sac which is attached to the bee on the outside. So there's a chemical reaction that takes place that allows us to eat the honey because there's nothing unkosher about it. There's no, now, if there are additives, and there are different types of honey, but pure bee honey by itself would be kosher, but you have to, but today in manufacturing, it will sometimes add flavorings. It will sometimes add other additives to it to make it clearer, make it a little lighter or darker, and that's where the texture comes. But pure bee honey by itself, and it's a fascinating study about the queen bee and how bees. I urge you to go on the OU website or some of the other websites to describe how the process is made, and because there's a statistic here someplace that bees fly, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of miles in their lifetime to make a fraction of an ounce of honey. That's why there are so many bees in a hive. It takes a lot of bees to fill that hive with honey. But the average bee flies so far to get the nectar from the plants, and it only produces a small amount. I mean, a bee isn't that big. Now, there are other insects that also produce a bee substance, and we have to be careful about that. Wasp honey, for example, is not kosher, because that's from internal. There's also, in some cases, raw honey has broken off pieces of bees' feet in it. It looks like tiny hairs. That's how small they are. But halakhically, those are considered like bones. So if you come across raw honey from a hive that you buy in a farm stand, and you have little black hairs, which are really pieces of the bee's foot, it's okay, halakhically. But the study of bees' honey is just fascinating. Well, you filter it to get out those types of impurities. You can, but you don't necessarily have to. Yeah, because that's produced a little bit differently than bees' honey.
Just like the color of the swirl, you say, at least we said, at one point, you need to have all these swirls in a truck. You don't know where milk come from? Is there any issue with honey that you don't know where the honey is coming from? It might be lost honey.
Well, that's why we buy stuff with a hashgacha. But if you're on a roadside farm stand and they have actual honeycombs with honey in it, you can buy them. As a matter of fact, I remember going back to my days as the first youth director of Shiur in early 1960s. And I used to have lunch at a different person's house every Shabbos. So I ate at the Manishevitz's house, Bill Manishevitz. And his wife served honey in the honeycombs. I remember that to this day. She served pieces of honeycomb for dessert with the honey still in it. And as a young kid, I remember that. Okay, moving on from honey. I hope that answers your question. Okay, moving on from honey to cheese. I don't mean to move on from honey, but going on to cheese. Where did cheese come from the first time? So legend has it, and I don't know how old this legend is, thousands of years ago, an Arabian nomad was carrying milk from point A to point B. And the sack that he used to carry it was a cow's stomach. You know, when they would slaughter animals, they would use every part of that animal for different purposes. So a cow's stomach is, there's several stomachs, but is very, very big. So it became a sack. So he carried the milk from point A to point B in this cow's stomach. And when he got to where he was going, he opens up the sack, and this milk is now solid. So something similar to what we would call cheese today. And he noticed that and then from there, it came to realization that there was something in the stomach lining of this cow, and the same thing applies to goats, which would basically harden milk and make it into something more solid known as cheese. So that's where we understood that the rennet, or the renin, which is a chemical in the digestive lining of the cow's stomach, breaks down the cheese, the milk rather, and solidifies it and becomes hard cheese. Now, contemporary cheese is basically made the same way. Other things are added to it, but basically the key ingredient to making milk into cheese is this chemical known as renin, or rennet, that comes from the cow's lining. Different cheeses are made in different ways. We're talking now primarily about hard cheeses. So Parmesan cheese, for example, is produced by adding rennet to scalding hot milk and then aging it for over a year. Mozzarella cheese is cooked and stretched in a large tub, very elasticized, very good for pizza. Mozzarella and other cheeses are submerged into a saltwater solution called brining to protect it from spoilage. Cheddar cheese is produced in a cooler environment. It's often aged. And again, all these different processes result in different textures, different tastes. The more cheese is aged, the stronger the flavor is. And every country, the possible exception of the United States, has its own variety of cheese developed over hundreds, if not thousands of years. European cheeses are considered to be of a higher quality. And there's so many different brands: Camembert, Swiss cheese, Emmentaler, cheddar. I mean, you go on and on and on. Every country, feta cheeses, Gloucester cheeses. American cheese, somebody compared American cheese to a hot dog. We throw a whole bunch of stuff in it and it makes something. American cheese is a combination of all different types of things that are left over from other processes. It is not the highest quality, put it that way, of the cheese products. But basically, cheese is made from cow's rennet, the enzyme which lines the fourth stomach of a cow. And In some countries, they still use animal rennet. Most cheeses, I would say 99, if not 100% of the cheeses made in America are made with synthetic rennet, microbial rennet, rather than calf rennet. It's simply more economical to do that. But since there's the smallest possibility that in some cases imported cheeses might be using actual calf rennet, that's why you need hashgacha. And in kosher cheese production, it becomes more expensive because you have to send field representatives to far-flung places to supervise the production of cheeses. Bear in mind, as I've said many times before, I am not paskin any halachos here. And if you have any questions, you ask your local rabbi. And I said, almost all cheeses in America are produced with microbial or vegetable rennet, or kosher rennet from a kosherly slaughtered animal. However, that being said, and there are many different types of rennet. I don't want to go through all the. I remember as a ninth grade biology student, we had Dr. Frankel, was a biology teacher, a wonderful teacher. And he began the class, he had a beaker of milk, tall beaker of milk. And at the beginning of the class, he took a cup and he poured a few ounces of some liquid into the beaker. And then he went on teaching the class. And then about 20 minutes later, he takes this beaker of milk and he dumps it on a student's desk. Everybody sits back. But it came out as a blob because what he put in was rennet and it had solidified the milk. Obviously, it was a very, if I can remember today, it was a very important visual lesson that I can still remember. There are many, many different types of rennet, but today, as I said, almost all rennet in the United States is non-animal rennet. But since we don't know, we don't have a guarantee, we don't know where it comes from, that's why you need hashgacha. Rav Soloveitchik was not a posek. He was a Rebbe, a Malamed, he would call himself. And he never wrote down or paskined questions. And he did things, he had many, many minhagim of his own that is for him. Some things students, particularly in terms of nusach hatfilah, some things would be emulated by his talmidim. Others would not necessarily. And one of his personal practices, he was known to eat Kraft cheeses, personally. But he said, I am not paskening, I am not telling my talmidim what to do, and I wish you wouldn't publicize this. But for himself, again, I don't know what was going on in the Rav's huge mind and how he balanced all the different shitos and so forth and so on. But given the fact, and this was in the 1950s already, and today even more so, but just be aware that the importance of eating kosher cheeses is not absolute. But once you have kosher cheeses on the market, we're not going to put them all out of business necessarily, but this was the Rav's minhag, not for publication, not for dissemination. It was his own personal minhag that he was known to eat regular cheese. Okay, moving on to the last subject, Jello, or gel caps. I don't know how many people still eat Jello today anymore, unless they're in a hospital. But gel caps are quite common. In the 50s, there was a whole discussion about a product called Kogel, whether you could use Kogel or not. Basically, how is Jello made? Gelatin is the main ingredient that solidifies this liquid mass into jello, just like rennet makes milk into cheese. Gelatin makes a liquid substance into what we call jello, also a semi-solid substance. And gelatin comes from boiling animal hoofs. Take an animal's hoofs. Now, again, just be aware, again, nothing goes to waste in a slaughterhouse. I don't encourage you to visit a slaughterhouse, but should you visit a slaughterhouse, a kosher slaughterhouse, put it that way, you'll notice that nothing goes to waste. Once the animal is shechted, so the meat, obviously, if it's kosher, if they didn't find any imperfections or holes in the lungs, and it's considered to be kosher, would go to the various meat suppliers, purveyors, and butchers, and so forth. The skin will be ripped off the animal hides and sent to one place that processes animal hides. The blood is saved in buckets. We eat chocolate pudding. Goyim eat blood pudding because blood congeals into something similar to chocolate pudding. And they sell it and they eat it in treif pudding. So they sell the blood. The bones are sold to somebody else. The hoofs are sold to somebody. Now, gelatin is made by boiling animal hoofs. And when you add it to water, again, that too becomes a jelly type of substance. So the problem number one is, if you're making gelatin from hoofs, does that make it fleshig? Because I remember once hearing in Shiur, Rabbi Soloveitchik said that sometimes when they boil the hoofs, there are pieces of meat from the treif animal in there too, or even a kosher animal in some case. But even in most cases, it's treif animals, or even, and if it's a kosher animal, the question of it's fleshig. So if you're boiling hoofs and skin, that would require hashgacha. And we don't know where the gelatin for the jello comes from, so we can't eat it. Along comes a company called Kogel, which guaranteed that the bones that were used came from kosherly slaughtered animals. And the whole machlokas, whether in fact that was acceptable or not, because if it was acceptable, does that make the Kogel fleshig? There's a whole machlokas. I don't know if Kogel is still marketed. It's still sold, Kogel? All right. But today, kosher gelatin is made usually from seaweed or some other vegetable source. And in all probability, most Jello, don't quote me on this, please. In all probability, most Jello is not produced anymore from animal bones. But you don't know that, so you have to have a hashgacha.
You don't have a situation like kosher where it claims to be kosher, even though it's.
Yeah, oh, so now, so what was the claim? The claim, and it's not a spurious claim, it's based on solid halachic reasoning. When you take the bones, you don't just boil the bones, it goes through an acid process. So when it goes through this acid process, it's not recognizable as animal substance anymore. It's basically become chemical, a chemical of some sort. The chemistry has changed the nature of that thing into a powder that you can't recognize anymore. This came from an animal. So does that change in its appearance and molecular structure? And does that make it parv? Nothing else.
The bones themselves are not fleshig?
The bones are fleshig, sure they are.
No, but
But
you're saying
if you-
bones and meat is attached.
okay, so that is the question. If you take bones and you make it into a powder chemical.
No, let's say a raw bone, not making it into a count.
Yeah,
Bone by themselves, not fleshig.
probably not. But since
How
sometime
about marrow?
marrow is sure. But the problem is that sometimes when they cut off the hoofs from the animal, there's pieces of meat still attached to it. So that's part of the problem, at least according to Rabbi Soloveitchik. But clearly, if the gelatin is used today in America, in most cases, it probably comes from agar, which is seaweed. or some other chemical or vegetable form. But since we don't always know, they do make gelatin from bones still. And that's why you need kosher gelatin or hashgacha if you want to continue eating jello. But all of these things are the chemistry involved is a big machlokas rishonim. If I take an animal and I change it into a powder chemically, does it still retain its fleshicness, if I can use that word? Is it still considered meat if it has totally changed its essence? And this is a machlokas rishonim. Those say yes, those say no. And there's another halakha category called choser v'niyah, where it can become if you add water to it, does it become reconstituted back to its original fleishic essence? So that's why Jello, like cheese, does require a hashgacha, because we don't always know the sources of it, and if anything else was added to it. So hopefully you will enjoy all the different types of food that we talked about, but provided that it comes with a proper hashgacha, because today's manufacturing process is much more complicated than it was in years past. In years past, you knew what you were eating. Today, you have no idea what you're eating. You have no idea where it comes from. You have no idea what's mixed into the plant, because everything is now these huge industrial plants. And that's why today, mashgichim have to be chemists, scientists, and the experts that they have at the OU and the Chaf, these are people who are very knowledgeable in science and chemistry, because you have to be. And it's not always easy being a mashgiach for certain products, because some of these mashgichim have to travel to faraway places where the manufacturing plants are, overseas, in the Orient, on board a ship, in terms of fish. I mean, there's a lot of difficult things going on in order to guarantee what winds up on your plate is kosher. So we don't take it for granted. And in a certain sense, it was easier in previous generations to eat things because you knew where it came from. I mean, the shochet was a member of your community, and the shechita took place in your town, and you knew where the stuff came from. Today, you have no idea where your meat comes from. One last comment on meat, and then we'll bench. There is this discussion about Western meat. It was felt, it still is felt in many places, that meat that is produced out west is of a higher quality than locally produced beef. For whatever reason, plains, the grain, the raising area, whatever. But the problem is the slaughterhouses in Colorado and on the West Coast were several days away from the East Coast, where it is imported. Now, we know that between the time that an animal is slaughtered and until you consume it, the meat has to be washed and soaked within 3 days. And it takes more than 3 days sometimes to get here by truck or by railroad. So what would happen with Western meat under proper hashgacha? They would stop along the way in the Midwest someplace, and the local rabbi would come down to the depot with the fire trucks, and he would take the hose and he would hose down all the meat hanging in these railroad cars so that it would be acceptably rinsed before it gets to its destination on the East Coast. Problem is, not every rabbi was so trustworthy, because some rabbis would go, and say, with the fire trucks and hose down the entire truck, all the meat. Fine. Some less than orthodox rabbis in some cases would come to the train and take an atomizer and go spritz, spritz, and sign that it was rinsed. And that was a problem. So Western meat, I always had a question mark about it. Today, with airlines and shipping, it's less of a problem. But these are issues. So when you cut into your steak, when you eat your hamburger, how it got to your plate, there are many, many, many steps. And that's why you need proper hashgacha to know all the things involved before you can eat your fleischer dish. I think a wonderful trip for this group would be to a slaughterhouse. Just,
Just go both ahead.
and it's not for everybody, because you have to wear raincoats and boots when you go there, because there's blood all over the place. But I don't want to spoil your appetite, but in any event,
I remember, like, my uncle, Rabbi David Silver.
Yes.
Rabbi Harris,
right,
he would tell me he would get calls, they need the rabbi to bless meat.
yeah.
And it was obviously to wash the meat, he understood what it meant, but, the guy who knows meat, so they say.
Yeah.
"Bless the meat."
There's a lot of misconceptions. In any event, have a hearty appetite. Any other questions? Okay, have a great day.
Thank you, Wally.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mandy. Thank you, honey.
While you'll leave the mention.
Rabbi Saini Varech. Yishem Europ Metov Yad Olam, B'Shus Kol B'Sumin Kan, Varech Shechal Mishalo. Baruch Shechal Mishalo, Tivot Hayinu, Baruch HaTorah, Ramazan Esol, Tamid Lochos Alayim. Baruch Atah Adonai Azon Es HaKol. Baruch atah Adonai al haaretz v'al hamazon. V'nei Yerushalayim yer hakodesh me'ero v'yomeinu baruch atah Adonai v'nei v'rachamo v'Yerushalayim. Amen. Baruch atah v'mikoto v'olam hayichasreinu.
Years ago, I said over 30 years ago, in the men's club, we had Judy Rosenbaum.
Yes.
Shiur and Kashrus.
Yeah, he was here last year also.
Yeah, well, we did an interview with him.
Yeah.
In Jerry Hyde's backyard, okay? And he took, I don't know, I think cookies, or I forgot what he took, and he started reading the ingredients from the cookies.
Right.
And he said, do you have any idea
What these things, of course.
I know but he told us what it was. And it's exactly what you said, you have to be a chemist, because I think one thing that he said was a byproduct of a non-kosher animal, but no one knew that.
No.
That's why he said today, it's nowhere near how it used to be. You have to have hashgacha on everything.
When Trump becomes president, things are going to change, because the new leader of the health department is going to knock out a lot of this stuff.
When the OK Laboratories was founded in the late 1940s, early 1950s, the guy who started was a member of my shul, name was George Goldstein. He was a chemist, because